What's going on, boys and girls? Yes, I'm doing another reaction video. Now, this one in particular is from FastGadgets. As you can tell, this is going to be an interesting one because the topic is switching to Linux after 20 years on Windows? Question mark. Basically, he's asking if you can do it. I'm curious to see what he has to say. So, let's find out.
Alright, Gadgeteers, welcome back. I'm just hanging out here on the deck again with my poochies. I've got my new Sony AX53 with the, I believe it's the Rode microphone on top, and it comes with the Dead Cat. I prefer to call it the Fuzzy Bunny because I think the Dead Cat just sounds so sad and so nasty. Anyway, so the audio may be a little bit high or low, or you may hear some background noise. This is really just some experimentation with my new equipment, so forgive me if you do hear some sound. There's a voice mumbling behind me. I don't know if you can hear it. That is actually about, I would say 3 miles away is a football stadium for a high school, and they're having, I guess, an early scrimmage game. I'm not really sure, but anyway, you can hear the announcer all the way from here. Hopefully that isn't too much of a problem. But this is a Linux video, and I just received this comment I'm going to read to you from somebody on my YouTube channel. He says, I'm 41 years old and use Windows for the past 20 years or more. How easy is it to switch to Linux OS? I've always had a fear of being lost in using the OS. I thought that was a really good question, and it really made me start thinking. Now, a lot of my videos I've talked about the 5 reasons why I use Linux, the 10 reasons why I think Linux is the best, reasons why you should use Linux, reasons why you shouldn't use Linux, and this is one of the ones I actually never really thought about, but I'm gonna look at it from this person's point of view and from my point of view. So if I turn that around, I'm thinking, why should I use Windows? Well, I'm the opposite of this person. I've been using Linux, I would say, full-time, meaning about 90% of the time. The other 10% is Windows or Mac, usually Windows only for work purposes. So the majority of the time I'm using Linux, and it's been well over 10 years now. Now, I've been using Linux much longer than that, but as my full-time go-to operating system, it is Linux. So, case in point, my Dell Ryzen 5675, I reinstalled Linux. The whole process, including applications, took me about 30 minutes, and I spent maybe another 20 minutes finessing the OS the way I want it, so I can get Linux running, and my chosen one, of course, is Fedora, very, very quickly. That would not be the case for me with Windows. So if I flip that coin back over and look at this comment, after 20 years, would you really want to go to Linux? So I'm going to broaden that response to anybody who's thinking about Linux but has been on Windows for a very long time. So I'm going to start with some basic questions. Number one, is there something that Windows does or does not do for you? More importantly, does not.
Okay, so I gave this video a good 3 minutes to get into this because I was curious to see what he was actually going to say. The short version is, after 20 years, the length of time you use something really, at the end of the day, doesn't really fucking matter all that much. Because let's be honest, users just want technology to do stuff and to do what they need to with it. That is really it. It's no different than switching phone OSs. It's no different than... There is a learning curve regardless of what you go to. It doesn't matter if you go to Mac OS from Windows, or from Mac OS to Windows, or Windows to Linux, or Mac OS to Linux. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. it all depends on your willingness to want to learn. You're going into stuff with an open mind. If you're going into it with a closed mind and expecting it to work 100% the same way you just from the thing you just came from, then no, stick with what you do, because you're not taking it as to an open-minded approach, and you are bound to fail with that mentality. If you are closed-minded about switching to things and you are dead set against it, or if you're not even remotely open to the fact that stuff will be different, then you are 100% more than likely gonna fail. That is just straight out the fact. So my first suggestion would be to this particular question is, can you be open-minded? And are you willing to accept that things are going to be different? And you have to also be willing to learn. Because with differences comes prior knowledge won't matter when you're trying to learn something new. You can equate similar circumstances and situations and things and make similar comparisons, but similarity does not mean the same.
Not do is there something that in Windows you absolutely need that you're not getting, and you need to look at another operating system? Next question, is there something in Windows that you must have that you're used to? And the third question, having been on Windows so long, do you really want to make the switch to Linux? So instead of just doing a full-blown Linux installation, what you could do is download an ISO and put it on a thumb drive and run it as a live installation. So instead of actually installing it to your hard drive.
I love live USB environments. It makes it easier to test hardware. It makes it easy to see if this particular distro is going to work for you. This is a person that has been using Windows for 20 years. You have to understand the problem with this suggestion right off, though, is the fact that you're making it based on the assumption they know how to boot into a live USB. Generically, now, my approach is going to be different than yours. You're giving the user some credit, thinking that they actually know what the hell they're doing. I give end users no such credit. I think they're all morons. You treat them like you go into it with the lowest common expectation and denominator, and if they're above it, no, you're a few steps ahead. So things like telling them to disable secure boot, things like that, you might want to throw their way in that recommendation. I'm just saying.
Experiment with it and run it a while. Now here's the thing, somebody who's been on Windows for 20 plus years, even the concept of downloading an ISO and finding a tool that will write that ISO as an installable media to a thumb drive sounds trivial to me. I do it all the time, so it's nothing. It means nothing to me to do it. It only takes 5 minutes. That might not be the case for somebody who has been on Windows a long time and are not really that into installing operating systems. So that could be another reason why you might not want to go to Linux, is the impediment of getting the thumb drive set up, the ISO downloaded, and booting into, which is the easiest part, of course, booting into a live CD or a live USB.
And with that said, I tend to agree. Like I just said, my biggest recommendation, again, to go with that question that you're asking them is, are they willing to understand that it is going to be, might be similar, but it's going to be different. Just because it's, again, similarities do not equal the same. The process is different, etc. Are they going to be willing to go into this with an open mind, or are they so set in their ways that any change is bad? If they're the type to get upset when Microsoft screws around with the UI every iteration of Windows that it decides to do, then Linux might not be the best place for them to go potentially. Because at least with Windows or Mac OS, I mean, really, if you want to talk ones that stay the same, you're probably talking Mac OS, because that thing, calling that UI crusty is an understatement at this point. At the end of the day, are they willing to accept that there's going to be changes? If not, changing an OS is probably not the best thing for them.
So if you're not willing to do that much, then no, you're not interested in Linux. But if you are, I would start with putting Linux on a live USB drive, because you still have Windows. You can always go back to Windows, and you can experiment with Linux for a couple of days or a week or so and see if you like the environment. I think you'll find that many of the applications that you're used to, of course, won't be there, and that you will find most likely will be the reason why you will leave Linux and stay on Windows. That's my thinking, because it's not just learning the operating system, it's also learning all of the applications and all of the tools, and also your workflow, the way you do things.
Now, when it comes, applications are important. Now, here's the thing. It depends on how the person's switching. If they are, for whatever reason, set on Edge or IE or, one specific application, then switching probably isn't going to be for them. It really depends. Like, if they are dependent on this, like, one obscure application that, does X, Y, or Z, and that's like their linchpin, well, and you can't pull it out with an open source alternative, might not want to switch. The best way is to give them as many tools that are available on Linux that are cross-platform. So if you give them Firefox as opposed to IE, they can run Firefox on Mac, Windows, and Linux. It doesn't, you try to trivialize the underlying and the underpinnings of the OS. Because at the end of the day, consumers and customers and end users, they really don't care. I mean, some do, but for the most part, most don't, as long as they can get their crap done. And they have applications that they are at least familiar with. And at the end of the day, that's really what matters. So for me, I found that the best way to get people to switch is to make the underlying OS a moot point, as long as they can use the applications or similar applications that they're used to on an environment they're coming from.
Now, I hear many people say Linux is just an operating system. The applications cover the same things as Windows applications. And to some extent that's true, but you have to admit, you do have to learn a new workflow. For those of you who are my Linux advocates, you know what I'm talking about. You use the Linux apps. Why don't you just switch to Windows and use Windows apps? Well, one reason is you don't want to, and the second is because your workflow would have to change and you would have to relearn the way you do things to some extent. And it's not simple. It actually is fairly complicated. It's even harder for somebody who's been on an operating system as long as this person has, 20 plus years. I boot into Windows on my new systems maybe once or twice, only because I have to. Now, there's a game I want to play that I'm probably going to play, and it can only play in Windows, so I probably will boot into Windows. But last week, I needed to do some hardware monitoring and some testing, and I booted into Windows, and I went to shut down, and don't you know, it had to install updates, then shut down, so I had to wait 20 minutes, and I'm just shaking my head, really annoyed, because it's not something I'm used to or like. And of course, on reboot, what does it do? Finishing installing updates, and it takes another 5 or 10 minutes. Very annoying to me, so that's one reason why I stay away from Windows. But I can see where this particular commenter is coming from. After you've tested out the live USB and you think you do like Linux, that's when I would seriously consider doing a dual boot installation. I'm not going to tell you which version of Linux is the best. I'm only going to tell you that there are many out there and there are a lot of choices. If I was starting out, I would be careful which one you choose, because you want to make sure that you can set up a dual boot environment with that version of Linux. With my limited knowledge of Ubuntu and Linux Mint, at least with Linux Mint version 18, it's not very kind to doing a dual boot. It wants to erase the drive and do a single install. On the other hand, Fedora, which is the
I haven't used Linux Mint for a long time, so I can't speak on that. Just not my flavor of distro. I can speak to Ubuntu, however, or Ubuntu, however you want to fucking pronounce it. Short version, it'll detect Windows and it'll ask install alongside in the Ubiquity installer, and you click that, and it takes you to how much space you want to give the drives and all that stuff. That's it. Click next, install. Hey, look, dual boot.
The one I use, and again, I'm not saying it's the best Linux version. I'm just saying that, at least in this case, it's something that I do like. Its default behavior is setting up a dual boot environment. So in that way, you know that you will not leave Windows disturbed, and you still will be able to use Windows, and you can boot into Linux when you want to boot into Linux. Of course, things get complicated when you decide to replace your drive, so that's another factor. Now, one of my viewers has suggested using an external drive. That's totally another option. I do know with Fedora, it will not install the bootloader on your Windows drive, so if you had a live USB running Fedora, and you installed Fedora, I have done this, onto another drive, an external drive or an external USB, you can do that, and then you would have an actual installation. The only thing is you'd have to remember to plug the drive in order to be able to boot from it so that you could get into Linux. And all these are factors that somebody who's been hanging out with Windows for 20 plus years might not want to get involved with. So here's the clincher. You've got the operating system installed, and you say, I really like Microsoft Word, so what do I use now? Well, then you're introduced to LibreOffice or OpenOffice, more likely LibreOffice, and it is very different. I know that those of us that are accustomed to using technology and feel very comfortable changing our workflows because of a different application, it's easy. But I teach a lot of people, and I'm not talking about just the younger generation. The classes I teach are basic introduction to Windows, and it ranges from 14 to 15-year-olds, because I have high school classes that come in, all the way up to people that are 80 years old. And their knowledge, not just their knowledge, but their interest or ability in changing to a Windows operating, from a Windows operating system to Linux, does vary. So not everybody's going to want to do that. So I guess the bottom line is, if you're seriously thinking about going to Linux and you've been on Windows for that long, the big question for me is, what is it you don't get from Windows that you want to get from Linux? Now, it may sound like I'm basically telling you don't go to Linux, but that's not the case at all. But I don't want you to have a pipe dream and think that Linux is going to answer all your prayers and your questions and your concerns once you get off of Windows, because that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes the devil you know is much better than the devil you don't know. I mean, that's just the way it is. What do you think about that? Are you on Windows and thinking, I do want to go to Linux, but it seems like it's a lot of work and I potentially could damage my Windows installation, which is possible depending on which flavor of Linux you decide to install and what options you take? Do you feel like if you're on Linux, you would be having a reason or an issue that would make you want to go to Windows? Or are you happy with what you have? Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Maybe gives you some food for thought. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1.
Okay, so with that basically being done, and sorry if you guys saw some flipping between stuff, trying to multitask. The end of this day, he does have a very valid point. You have to look at what your needs are, and really that's what it boils down to. Like he said at the end, if you're happy with what you are, nobody's ever, like, even us perpetual Linux users, none of us are really ever happy with what we have. We always want something different. We're always chasing the next distro. We're always chasing the next feature. We're always chasing the next kernel. We're always chasing something. It's the same thing with generic end users for the most part. What they're chasing is just different. They're chasing either stability, which Linux is great for stability, but it's still going to have issues like every OS. So at the end of the day, it really boils down to keeping an open mind, mitigating the underlying OS so it doesn't really matter. So use applications from in the environment you're currently in before you switch to, say, Linux or Mac or Windows, whatever on. If you mitigate the underlying need for applications, you mitigate whether or not or whatever OS you're running on. So maybe for video editing on Windows, use Kdenlive, use Shotcut. They're both available on Linux. There's ways to mitigate the need for applications. But at the end of the day, what really it boils down to is an open mind. And as like tech people, is our willingness to potentially help somebody, and not just like something I've dealt with before is a lot of Windows guys are, if they encounter Linux and they try, quote unquote, to solve a problem, their solution is nuke and pave. I run into this with Linux users who recommend a nuke and pave as their solution and hop distros. Distro hopping is great to try out new and different features, and sometimes it does fix a problem. I won't say that it doesn't. What I will say, though, that is the go-to solution, which it should never be. Because to me, that is putting too much of an onus, too much work, too much time down, and too much of a headache on the end user. Now, us as technophiles and all this other stuff, we love to do that stuff. Like, that's fine. But an end user, it's a tool to them. They don't care. So an open mind in mitigating application, like the need for applications, so it mitigates they don't care about what the underlying OS is. You're gonna find that more than likely they're gonna successfully try to make that shift. But there's work involved. But it's work on either the person putting them on to Linux or said OS from the one they're on, or it's work on the end user's part that's looking to make the switch. So there's a lot of what if factors, and there's a lot of stuff that has to change. Like for me, I like controlling my system. I might have a Windows 10 machine, but it's not out of choice. It's out of one reason, and it's called 700 and something games. Proton's great, still don't run them all though. So at the end of the day, though, that's a need on my part. That's a time and investment and money input. So there's reason for me to keep that. If there's a reason for somebody to stay on where they are, I'm not going to slag on them for doing that. At the end of the day, it really is about getting your fucking work done. So to me, I really have nothing to criticize with this, other than they're expanding on what his suggestions were. So sorry, no ranting, no raving. Like his points are valid, and again, to me, it's just going into it with an open mind, a willingness to like either learn or accept that things, while similar, are not the same. Again, similarities does not mean it's the same. So, and mitigating the application need by making the underlying OS not matter, those are the biggest things that I can add, and that just kind of expands on what he's mentioned. But if you're happy or you can get done with what you can get done in what OS you're currently in, use it. But if for like a principal reason, like you don't like how Windows 10 handles updates, you don't like how Windows is, the terms of service and its EULA, etc., then you're gonna have to be willing to look at those alternatives and understand that those alternatives ain't gonna be the same. Similarities, but not the same. So you guys know what to do. Have an open mind, but you also know what to do, and that's rate it, subscribe. Peace out.